so I'm sharing it now, and I'll have a link and share with everybody, and then we can all switch off our camera and come back at 3 o'clock.
Okay, if you, yeah, you're going to put the link on chat.
Yeah, I will.
So, but tell me,
Oh, we're live.
who is first, Patrick or me?
Well, it's
You're
up to
first.
you. I was
and
going to
I'm-
ask you. Yeah. Okay. If Sylvia says you're first, you're first.
I'm first. Okay.
Yeah, you're
Okay.
first. Yeah, because Patrick is on the way to a hotel. But by the way, everything we say here has been live streamed onto YouTube, just so that you know. But we can keep on talking.
That's fine.
Okay. So I think this is the YouTube link. Have a look.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to send that out now.
Okay, I'm going to switch off my camera and come back in 4 minutes. Yep. Okay. I think it's 3 o'clock, so we could start. Now you're muted.
Hello, thanks, Sylvia. So this is the last in the series of seminars organized by Frontiers in Virtual Reality since last May. And I'm very pleased today to welcome, first of all, 2 speakers. And then this will be followed by a short panel for about half an hour to discuss some of the issues raised. So the first speaker, I'm going to actually read out about both speakers first. What I suggest is that both speakers complete their talks, and then there's questions during the panel time. So we won't take questions for each speaker immediately after their talk. So the first speaker is Professor Thomas Metzinger. He's Professor of Theoretical Philosophy at the Johannes Gutenberg University of Mainz. He's a director of the Theoretical Philosophy Group and the Research Group on Neuroethics, Neurophilosophy at the Department of Philosophy. He was a fellow at Gutenberg Research College up to 2019. He's also a founder of the Open Mind Group and an adjunct fellow at the Frankfurt Institute of Advanced Studies in Germany. So his research centers on the analytic philosophy of mind, applied ethics, philosophy of cognition, and philosophy of mind. He's very well known for a series of books. One is called The Ego Tunnel, another Conscious Experience, another Neurocorrelates of Consciousness, as well as a scientific monograph called Being No One. If you want to start to get into his work and you're not a philosopher, but you're very interested in VR, he has a paper called Why is Virtual Reality Interesting for Philosophers? Was published in 2018 in Frontiers in Robotics and AI. So the second speaker is Professor Patrick Haggard of the Institute of Cognitive Neuroscience at University College London. His work is on the cognitive neuroscience of voluntary action, the representation of one's body. How does the brain create and maintain a representation of the body as a physical object? He's very well known for his work on agency, and he has nearly 600 publications. He's one of the authors of the Ethics of Realism in Virtual and Augmented Reality, and actually some of the panel are authors of that paper as well. So I know both Thomas and Patrick through, well, I know them from other reasons, but I worked with them both on a project called Virtual Embodiment and Robotic Re-embodiment, the VERY project, which ended in 2015 or so, though in some ways it's still going strong. And out of that project came a paper that was published in Frontiers in Virtual Environments by Michael Madurai and Thomas Metzinger, called Real Virtuality, a Code of Ethical Conduct and Recommendations for Good Scientific Practice and Consumers of VR Technology. So I very much enjoyed working both with Patrick and Thomas over those years, I think 6 years of that project, and pleased to be collaborating with them again. So as I said, first of all, there'll be the 2 talks and then a panel. And I suggest that we keep questions. You can start posting your questions on YouTube or on Zoom, but we'll do all the questions during the panel session. So thanks very much, and over to you, Thomas.
Okay. So can you all see my screen?
I
Yeah.
don't think so. I don't think I can see your screen.
You cannot see my screen?
No, I can't.
Oops.
Press share screen.
Yeah, I would have, wait a minute. This has kicked me out. All right.
Yeah, we can see your screen now.
Do you hear me well?
Yeah, perfect.
So thanks very much for the introduction. What I wanted to do in the next 25 minutes is to give you first a quick overview, maybe 15 minutes, about some problems in applied ethics for extended reality technologies. And then I want to zoom out in 2 steps into the wider context, look at technological confluence, and end on 2 general problems we all have together in the applied ethics. So as an introductory example, let me just begin with a now classical pilot study Ori Cohen and Doran Friedman did 8 years ago, and I'm sure many of you know this study. So the subject was lying in a scanner in Israel, imagining movements, and 4,000 kilometers away in southern France, there was a robot. The subject could see via goggles through the eyes of the robot and try to control the robot with motor imagery. I'm sure many of you have seen videos on YouTube. For philosophers, that's interesting. I have coined a new technical concept, which you see at the bottom in the figure legend, namely PSM actions. PSM actions are a historically new kind of actions human beings can perform. PSM is the abbreviation for phenomenal self-model, the conscious self-model in your brain. And what that subject does, it only acts with her or his conscious self-model by simulating motor behavior and bypassing the non-neural body, directly going into a technical environment. So PSM actions are all actions where human agents take certain content layers of their conscious self-model offline, run conscious self simulations in order to achieve certain effects in the world, causally bypassing their proximate biological embodiment. So the interesting point is there are also second order mental actions, namely the capacity for intentional inhibition, to stop something that you are doing. And this might be interestingly different if you're embodied in a robot or an avatar. For instance, your capacity for impulse control might be very different if embedded into an artificial system. So here's this old thought experiment of mine again. Imagine you're lying in a scanner, you control a robot at a distance, you see through its eyes, you feel motor feedback, and you're fully identified with the robot. Then suddenly your ex-wife's new husband enters the room unexpectedly, that person who has just ruined your personal life a couple of months ago. You feel a deep sense of emotional hurt, and you have an automatic, spontaneously arising aggressive impulse, a short video running in your brain. You try to calm yourself down, but before you can do anything, the robot has lashed out and already killed the man with one single strike of enormous force. Then you regain control over your robot body and you manage to step back. It feels as if you never had a chance to control your behavior. But later in court, how will we decide if you objectively actually had the ability for the necessary form of intentional inhibition? So this is called the anarchic robot thought experiment. And one aspect, this is just an introductory example, is if a human being is causally coupled with an artificial system through the conscious self-model in the biological brain, and if it's a causally more direct way in which this is done, and the artificial system causes harm or physical damage, when exactly should we say that the human agent is ethically responsible or culpable in a legal sense? The deeper question is, what are rational and empirically grounded criteria for functional boundaries of autonomous agency? Imagine you're controlling an avatar in virtual reality, or a number of them. What ability do you have to possess as a human agent to count as responsible for the results of your own actions? Or are they your own actions. So this was just a thought experiment from this paper Mel already mentioned. It's an open access paper. If you want an overview of issues we deal with in the applied ethics of virtual reality, you can look at many details in there. It's all freely available. But besides the details, there are also some very general points. I think the first thing all scientists must understand is that following some code of ethics is not the same thing as being ethical. So what we actually need is a culture of ethical sensitivity in the scientific community itself. Why do we need this? First, the institutions are slow at best, and there are many new developments. For example, the confluence of extended reality technology and AI, or the AI arms race between China and the US. These are new things. Political institutions are very slow in reacting. Scientists have to take a stand. Philosophy is relevant because we need new conceptual tools from theoretical philosophy, like the tool of a PSM action, but we also need applied ethics. That's what we call practical philosophy in philosophy. And the reason for this is that all these new action potentials not only create new opportunities and risks, but historically new ethical problems. There's this wider horizon. We also need to do technology assessment, anthropology, societal, cultural consequences, and all that. I'm coming back to it. So here's a quick overview. The most obvious example is dual use of virtual reality technology. The US, for example, executes citizens of and in other sovereign states like Yemen, Somalia, and Pakistan. They do this with the help of the German government and without charge, trial, or any final judgment. That's called an extrajudicial killing. It violates international law because you can only use lethal force on a battlefield, but not outside of armed conflict zones. And it violates national law, of course. The technology we are talking about, virtual reality, robotic embodiment, is of course highly relevant because it allows re-embodiment in military robotic systems. These are the results. Here are some very old-fashioned numbers from long ago, 2013. So you had 360 attacks, killed 41 militants and 2,446 civilians. One thing we have to achieve, and it's almost impossible to achieve this, is to prevent an arms race between China and the US on the level of AI and related technologies. This looks bad, but we still have to try. It's in everybody's interest that we don't get an arms race above the level of nuclear arms. There are psychological risks, for instance, depersonalization disorder through VR, permanent changes in body perception. There is derealization disorder, or the Truman Show effect. Psychiatrists call this derealization. We don't know what long-term use of VR does to us. There may be permanent changes in social behavior, and that may be a highly addictive potential. So you all know that the social media algorithms continuously learn 24 hours a day in the attention war they are fighting against us, against the users of Facebook, to make us stay on screen longer than we originally planned. And they're getting better and better and better. You also know that Facebook has just swallowed Oculus, right? So the addictive potential of that technology will be a major topic in the future. Mental autonomy of human beings. Emotions and action intentions become publicly visible. This has to do with problems of privacy, consumer behavior, but it might also change our self-models in our own biological brains because they get directly coupled to that technology. What happens to the sense of agency? in children that grow up in these environments? What happens to their perception of the difference between man and machine? And could it change our moral personality? And just think about the problem, say, of child pornography in virtual reality. On the other hand, we all know that there are many positive psychological effects, like the rehabilitation of prisoners. Think of the work of Marvi Sanchez-Vives, the Proteus effect for openness, weakening of implicit racism, and so on. Altruism can be fostered and cultivated in virtual reality, and there will be many therapeutic applications. I want to make only one point here. If you have any ethical goals at all, you are also obliged to use the best means and technologies you have to achieve these goals. And this means that we have to implement these technologies and use them if we know their positive psychological effects, and we are ethically obliged to do this as fast as possible. There are all kinds of legal problems also on the boundary between philosophy and law. For example, liability issues. Autonomous machines and penal law is a problem, but there are also issues of data protection. Think about automatic readout of your own low-level intentions and emotions. Think out of determining personal identity through kinematic patterns, the kinesthetic fingerprint every one of us has that can be read out by Facebook very soon. It will be easy to triangulate people's personal identity. Then there are these more theoretical questions like, what is a legal entity in the first place? A combination of a human and a semi-autonomous avatar or robot. And the big question is, of course, what has all this got to do with democratic control? Social media, I think you can all see it in the news, how they shake and corrode the foundations of Western democracy as we speak. And these relationships have to be explored. Two more examples of questions for society as a whole. If we have virtual surrogate bodies, are they medical devices? Should your health insurance pay for it? What about distributive justice if it's very expensive? Another concrete example, in the age of deepfakes, resurrection of the dead. Some people think it would be wonderful to be able to speak of a deep fake of grandpa that has been regenerated. Other people think that would be horrible for our culture of mourning or for therapy. It's not a good idea. There are all these practical questions. There are issues of data security and privacy protection. And I want to point out that the famous Dr. Pan has just recently said, and that's very timely with Facebook acquiring Oculus, that VR uses much richer user input and can learn much more from its user in the future if it goes VR. So the data collected in VR can, of course, be misused to make us all more addicted, to diminish the mental autonomy of free citizens. And it's evaluating likes is a very different thing from evaluating head movements, for instance. So we will soon be able to read out users' emotional states, low-level tensions. There are questions, do the ethical rules actually apply as in real life, in virtual reality? That's the question of child pornography again. Should we just go by the rule of thumb? Everything that's unethical in real life is also unethical in virtual reality? Maybe that's a little crude. If we do that, we will soon see that there are many big differences between different cultures on this planet in the moral intuitions they have about what is morally permissible. The technology is global. And this leads us back to the case of moral applications. So slowly beginning to zoom out now into more general questions, conscious experience itself, as I've argued for a long time, is a biologically grounded form of virtual reality. Now, as these technologies penetrate the general population, more people will understand that this is the case, and this will have massive social cultural consequences. So in the end, I think XR environments will create a new socio-cognitive niche around us, and children, human beings who are not yet born, will grow up in this niche and adapt to it mentally. And that's part of the deeper problem that we are facing. But now let's get completely crazy. I want to draw your attention to the problem of technological confluence. It's not that we can do applied ethics for virtual reality in one box and specialize on this. Part of the problem is this massive acceleration that we see and the confluence of different technologies like extended reality and artificial intelligence and brain-computer interfaces and robotics and AI-driven social media. All this comes together right now, and that's part of the problems we have to solve in applied ethics. So in AI ethics, we find that there are highly diverse predictive horizons. We will have risks and strong effects on the job market by 2030. Nobody knows if we will ever have AGI or even super intelligence, and nobody knows when we will have anything like synthetic phenomenology. So what we need is differentiated research programs for these different risk predicting horizons and not sweeping general approaches. The problem is that for some of these risks, say human level general intelligence, you have a low likelihood of occurrence, but high existential risks for humanity. And that leads to the fact that some of these safety risks are counterintuitive. Human brains don't grasp them, that it is rational to invest resources into dealing with these X risks already today. So rational risk management in applied ethics is difficult. Why? First, rational public debates are hard to achieve because you have noise on the signal. You have sensational journalism. You have the industrial lobby that tries to water down the whole process. You have a lot of public noise on the communication about these issues. There are diffuse fears in the general population. And Europe finds itself between China and the US. It finds itself between a form of totalitarianism that is historically new and aggressive marketing from Silicon Valley. People already speak about immortality technologies, transhumanism. There are actually new religious movements and new churches. So the whole debate is already contaminated with a lot of irrationality. Therefore, it's very hard to achieve a more serious form of political consulting. And the political institutions, at least in Europe, they lack the relevant expertise. We would need a few hundred of brilliant, well-trained young ethicists in Europe now who are up to speed on the empirical frontier and have studied philosophical ethics very well. We have to build all this, and we are under time pressure. So this paper Mel just mentioned is a deliberately insane collection of bizarre ideas. And I want to present you zooming out two of these bizarre ideas. I looked in this paper, which is also open access, at some more philosophical applications of VR technology. And here are two of them. Do you know what RT fMRI NCCF is? It's real-time fMRI neurofeedback targeting the global neural correlate of consciousness. So that is something that might come into reach at some point. You know, I'm a philosopher of consciousness. We have this notion of a global neural correlate of consciousness, that set of properties in the brain that is minimally sufficient to fully determine the content of all of your subjective experience in one moment. and which cannot be made smaller anymore. Now imagine that we had a real-time fMRI representation of the global NCC, but we would directly convert this into a virtual reality environment. We would create a perceivable dynamic landscape in which you could walk along. You could walk around in your own neural correlate of consciousness in a VR environment. And maybe you could even causally interact with it in historically new ways. So what that would give you would be a model-based control of your own conscious experience, something we haven't had before. And the only thing that comes close to it is the stable lucid dream. Imagine a neuroscientist in a stable lucid dream. That neuroscientist knows that everything she feels and sees is determined by the neural correlate of consciousness active in the sleeping physical body. But unlike in that virtual reality setup, she doesn't have a feedback loop in her lucid dreams. So one possibility we could think about is lucid dreams with externally technically realized feedback loops via virtual reality. Let's go get a little crazier. Here's a seventh example in that paper, the bootstrapping scenario. Let's assume there are future AI systems that have begun using avatars, person-like interfaces to communicate with us, to trick us. Non-persons communicate with persons, but they do so with the help of person models that speak that natural language and so forth. So they could cause very robust social hallucinations and other mind's illusion in human users. But this opens the logical possibility that you had such combined systems out of AI and VR that begin to mutually cause social hallucinations in each other. So the idea is it could happen that the systems would apply the algorithms they've originally developed in human user modeling for man-machine interaction, now suddenly apply them to machine-machine communication, but still using individual avatars as their interfaces. So I very much like this recent Nautilus paper by French philosopher Raphael Millier. You all have heard about GPT-3. Now imagine AI-controlled avatars that use GPT-3. Millier has argued that GPT-3 is actually a new level of bullshitting. Of course, it has no understanding of the language output it generates, but it's impressive. Now, imagine that there could be, you all have read papers by Carl Friston, I assume. Carl has once said in a metaphorical manner that we are buildings that predict themselves into existence. Now imagine a community of AI-controlled avatars that bullshit each other into self-conscious existence, like a virtual America, if you want to. So in this setup, we would have systems who have learned to cause very reliable and robust social hallucinations in their users, optimizing their functionality, and now they begin to compete and try to cause social hallucinations in each other. I call these systems second-order avatars. A first avatar is only an AI or a virtual agent that uses an avatar as a communication interface. A second-order avatar is something different. It would be to be driven by a different self-model that has an illusion, an inbuilt illusion, falsely representing other virtual agents as real self-conscious entities. So you would have systems emerging with inbuilt other minds illusions. And that could actually lead to a historically new effect, namely to virtual intersubjectivity. I will not go into this today, but you know that this begins possibly to border on artificial consciousness. you know that I've said in this paper for the EU that we should have a moratorium on synthetic phenomenology as long as we're not exactly knowing what we're doing, but I will skip this in the interest of time and already come to the last 5 minutes of this short presentation. I just want to draw your attention to two very general problems we have in the applied ethics of virtual reality. Two general problems, which mean you have to learn 3 new words now, and then we're done. So I have been working from 2018 to 2020 in the European Commission's high-level inefficiency group on artificial intelligence. We published our ethics guidelines on the 8th of April 2019, and we published our policy and investment recommendations for trustworthy AI on the 26th of June last year. And one problem that I have really become acutely aware of is a problem that applied ethicists call the pacing gap. That's the first word you have to learn. And that pacing problem is very simple and easy to understand. Existing governance structures are not able to respond to the challenge fast enough. Political oversight has already fallen far behind technological evolution. Just think about that that confluence of different technologies and the general acceleration I have briefly pointed to. So what we actually need is some form of meta-governance. We need a governance of governance that comes up with clever new ideas how we could be much faster in rational and evidence-based regulation in these specific sectors of technology. So problem one is the pacing gap, and the political institutions don't look like they can even remotely solve this problem for us. Now you have to learn 2 more words and then we're done. The second word is ethics washing. Ethics washing means that you organize and cultivate ethical debates because you want to delay, postpone, avoid, or deter people from active regulation or policy making. So there are some people who have an interest in public debates about ethics because it buys them time before real serious regulation arrives. It buys them time in which they can expand their monopolies and their power structures. And so ethics debates as such are a two-edged sword. There are people who like us to debate ethics endlessly as long as it delays the process. So what we need is binding, enforceable rules that have the full legitimacy of a democratic process. And here's the last word, the invisible bottleneck. Something most of us are unaware because you can hardly see it in any media is the activities of the industrial lobby, which systematically disrupts political will formation, for instance, in Brussels or Berlin, and which attempts to neutralize the results of academic research in applied ethics or publicly visible ethics debates. And I've heard the concept of a glass ceiling. People who are working in this area are always surprised that nothing ever arrives at the top. So whatever we as scientists come up with, or civil society comes up with in terms of public debates and goals we want to have implemented, there's always this glass ceiling. And that's a big problem we have to solve because this invisible bottleneck cannot be portrayed in the media. These are secret processes happening. This brings me to the end. A very brief summary. XR ethics is a special domain because there's a vast number of applications, different predictive horizons. We have an accelerating confluence and the pacing gap. We need to optimize the risk-benefit ratio. And what we would actually need is an evidence-based, fully realistic, rational argument-based, anti-ideological, and intellectually honest approach to all of this. It's difficult to achieve this. Strong noise on the signal by industrial lobby and ethics washing. Europe finds itself in a uniquely different historical situation between the US and China. And in Europe, political institutions and the business sector have a strong tendency to act unethically because there are really lacking moral incentives. But the loss of trust in such technologies and a loss of ethical reputations can be economically relevant. Trustworthy AI made in Europe is actually a brilliant idea as a unique selling point, but right now it doesn't look very likely. So somehow civil society and scientific community have to lead the debate and break that invisible bottleneck. I have no idea how to do it. Maybe you have an idea. Thank you very much for your attention.
Hi, great talk. I'm just trying to bring Mel's video back. Allow. Okay, Mel, can you please start your video? I just want to give you a round of applause. It's
Yes.
a fascinating talk.
Thank you very much.
I hate presenting on Zoom because there's no feedback, but I was like nodding a lot. I wish I had my video.
Yes. Thanks very much for this really interesting and thought-provoking talk. I'm sure it's going to raise a lot of questions from the audience. We'll save those for the panel discussion at the end. And next, I would like to introduce Patrick Haggard. Patrick, you weren't here, but I gave the introduction about you earlier. So you're now in control.
Good, thank you very much. I'm hoping that you can hear me. If somebody can wave or put up their hands to indicate that they can hear me, that's very good. Great, thank you. I'm sorry I was a few minutes late joining, but thank you very much for inviting me to this nice session. And thank you, Thomas, very nice to see you again and to hear your fantastic talk. So I'm going to talk for about 20 to 30 minutes, and I think I have to share my screen first. So let me try to do that.
Okay.
And the
yeah, we can see your screen. Yeah,
you can.
okay.
Good. So now if I start the PowerPoint,
yeah.
Can you see? I'm in presentation mode, but I guess you're not in presentation mode. You can just see one slide, or can you see my notes as well?
We actually don't. I don't see your presentation. I only see the PowerPoint. I don't see it in presentation mode. I don't know why.
Good. That's fine. That's fine. So I need to see it in presentation mode, but you
should
should
not. No, sorry.
So,
so I can see it in. I can see a PowerPoint with like. It's not like he's playing. Do you see what I mean? It's not being played. Wait, we see your notes. Yes, that's the. Well, I don't actually see your notes, but we could see your notes if there are any notes.
Is that now good? Can you just see my slide as I change it?
No, I think your screen has frozen.
Okay, so
can you maybe go to the next slide, and because I only see you're basically stuck at slide 1.
I think this is a problem with Zoom, which I've never quite understood. So let me stop the share.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe sharing again.
Okay, and then let me reshare.
Yeah. Yes, works now. Perfect.
Okay, so you should see my title slide.
Yeah, perfect.
Which is Ethics of VR, XR, and AR, a Cognitive Perspective. And you should be able to see my next slide if I move on to it. Good. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much. I'm sorry for the technological slowness. So I'd like to, first of all, thank the Paris Institute of Advanced Study, where I'm a visiting professor at the moment, for the research fellowship, which has made my participation today possible. And I have a background in cognitive psychology, and I work on basic human mental processes at University College London. So what I decided to do, having had this nice invitation, is to try to think about the ethics of virtual reality from the point of view of how our minds function and how our brains function. And you've already heard from Thomas the enormous importance of these technologies in terms of their effects on consciousness. And I'm going to be continuing a little bit that theme about by asking, what are the ethical issues that result from the way that these technologies so profoundly change our experience? So a key word in my talk is the word experience. So I believe that humans and other animals have experience, and this is absolutely fundamental to their being. And one of the interesting features about these new technologies, such as VR, XR, and AR, is they are experience generators. They are capable of generating, creating, and manipulating experiences. And maybe that is one of the interesting ethical situations where we can derive ought from is. Maybe there's something about the way that our minds generate experiences which leads to some important ethical considerations. So just by way of an introduction, I think it's standard in technology studies to distinguish between in risk analysis between the current known risks and the future risks. So there are some current known risks of VR. It can give you a headache. It could make you fall over. And I'm not really going to talk about those. I'm going to talk more, perhaps like Thomas, about the future risks and horizon scanning. So what are the future ethical hazards? And here you have to balance two attitudes or two principles. The first one is the well-known precautionary principle, which is standardly used with new technological innovations, which basically means let's be careful, let's check whether this technology is acceptable, whether it will have unforeseen collateral damage on people, and let's proceed slowly to check that it really is safe and that it really is something that we want. And this has been standard back a couple of decades ago. I worked on the ethics of mobile phones, which were then seen as being ethically extremely dangerous. Maybe they still are. And we adopted a precautionary principle about mobile telephony. And of course, the alternative is the so-called Cassandra complex, that with every technological innovation that comes along, you have hordes of applied ethicists who express fear and anxiety and maybe are paralyzed by it. So we have to try and walk somewhere between those two alternatives. What I'm going to do in the next 20 minutes is just try and cover three topics. Very quickly, I'm going to talk about the acute and chronic risks related to VR procedures, related to the way that we use it. I'm then going to spend a little bit of time talking about the idea of autonomy of experience. So I'll introduce that as we come onto it, and I'll analogize it to the autonomy of action. And then I think, in my view, one of the biggest problems we're going to meet first is the problem of reconstruction of autobiographical memory through customized, tailored, individual-specific VR, AR, XR. And I think there are going to be some real risks there, so I want to spend a bit of time talking about them. So first of all, the risks related to the VR procedure. So these are really pretty well known. So there are things like dizziness, there are things like headaches, there are things like feeling sick, and there are things like feeling social embarrassment when you realize that all your friends have been watching you being silly with a funny headset on. So these are sort of fairly well known, and they're typically short term. So they're typically things which stop when the experience stops. And of course, at the moment, we have a system where use of VR is voluntary. So if I start to feel a headache, I can take off the goggles and then I feel fine. Now, I think these things are really not a problem. These are just risks that are associated with using this particular equipment, and they're not conceptually different from the risks that are involved in doing anything or using anything. And I think they can be well managed by users themselves. And in the context of researchers, I think many of us on this conference are going to be researchers, they can be managed by the standard roots of university ethical committees and so on. So I'm not too worried about those. Now, the chronic effects, these are the potential long-term effects. So there's very little is known about this. Very little is known about whether, for example, spending a substantial part of your life in a virtual reality experience in an immersive kind of technology, whether this will have after effects which outlive the experience itself. These could, again, be of the same sort of general neuropsychological type. They could be difficulties with balance. They could be multisensory integration difficulties. And it's not a literature that I've followed all that much, but I think these chronic effects seem to be not too serious with current devices and at current usage levels. And again, I think they can be covered by the standard ethical procedures. So the thing about these long-term effects is we just need to be monitoring for them. From what we can see so far, they seem to be containable, but we need to be aware that they may change as technology changes and as our usage increases, as we will have had more and more cumulative exposure for more and more hours per day and years per lifetime. So that's all I really want to say about risk. And I think as researchers, we truthfully write in our ethical applications about the risks we know about. And for the moment, I think our brains can cope with the equipment. I think a more interesting point that I want to discuss is the point about autonomy. Now, I have a background working in voluntary action and in free will, if you like. And one of the basic things that people talk about in that neuroscientific literature is the idea that some agents, at least healthy adult humans, may have autonomy of action. So what does autonomy of action mean? Well, it means that basically whether you act or not is up to you. I don't want to get into debates about whether your actions are determined by your brain or whether your actions are determined by the environment. Well, of course they are, but the humans have a rather distinctive ability to generate actions in the absence of immediate external instruction. So if you ask a healthy adult human to make a choice between alternatives which are exactly identical and equal, and there's no particular reason to prefer one from the other, then the person will be able to choose, and they will have autonomously decided, I'm going to take that road at the crossroads, or I'm going to play that tune. Now, we're very in our society, we're very aware of the issues around autonomy of action, and we really try to respect individual autonomy of action, or we should, and we try not to restrict it. So, for example, only the state can compel me to do various things. So if I want to do something, then probably that's all right, as long as it doesn't harm others, and as long as the state does not compel me not to do it. So we respect the idea of autonomy of action. Now, what I want to introduce is the idea that just as our actions may come from our own internal autonomous choices, maybe we need to think about our experiences in the same way. Maybe my experiences are, in fact, the product of my own autonomous actions. Maybe, for example, if I don't like rock music and you take me to a bar where they are playing rock music, I will change my experience by the action of leaving the bar and going into another bar next door where they play Mozart. So I think all the time, human individuals are actually using their autonomy of action to produce or to construct environments which give them experiences that they want. So the autonomy of experience is perhaps in a way even more important than the autonomy of action. If you don't like it, you can leave. If you enjoy green open space, you are free to go and live in the country. If you want to watch bad British comedies, I bet there is a TV channel which is just right for you, and you just need to click this button. So we deeply believe that individuals should have autonomous control over their experience. And this, of course, is really interesting, because what we exercise this in the way we move around our environment and in the way that we construct our environment to produce particular experiences that we desire. But with technologies and with the technologization of experience, the way that my experience is controlled has changed. There's a lot about this in the media. There's a lot about this in the fake news discourse at the moment, which is, I think, quite convincingly showing that our news environment is no longer under our control. And I think, in a way, some quite similar points can be made about virtual reality and cognate technology. So let me try and see what I mean. So as I've said, I think we can understand the idea that at least healthy adult humans may have a right to a kind of self-stimulation and a right to control their own perceptual environment. So as long as it doesn't harm others, that's a sort of classic always golden rule kind of thing, maybe I should be allowed to experience particular kinds of environments, and I should be allowed to construct particular kinds of experiences. Now, that right is not absolute. So we do sometimes require people to undergo particular experiences that they may not want. So all of us will have received emails saying, you must watch this training video. Every time we used to get on a plane, we had to remove our headphones and listen to this important safety announcement. So you may want to have autonomous control of an experience of Mozart, but you must listen to the safety briefing. And the reasons why we allow others in this way to enter into our experience tend to be always relatively clear. So we have to listen to the safety briefing because it may be important to us and to others if there's an accident, and similarly for the training video. And in fact, education, which I think is a rather interesting behavior that none of us quite understand, is in a way a sort of non-autonomous experience which we inflict on children up to a certain age. So on the one hand, we might feel we have a right to self-stimulation and control our environment, but on the other hand, it does seem that we can also, or I would like to suggest, we also may have a duty to face reality. So is it really allowable that I construct a virtual reality, an experience for myself, which does not respect some fundamental ground truths of the way the world really is? So let's take a philosophically realist position about the world, and let's say there is a world out there and it's got these things in it which are happening. And from that, can we say that you, as an agent, as a member of society, must be aware of those things? You must experience the world around you, and in particular, you must experience some elements of the world around you which are really ethically important. So maybe agents must face the reality of the bad consequences of their actions. So this is a fairly standard thing that we see once again in the way that we treat children. So when my child hits another child and makes them cry, I would say, now look what you have just done to her. She is crying. You have to face the reality of the bad consequences of your own actions. And this is a nice example of me denying autonomy of experience to my child and forcing my child to have an experience of the ground truth of reality as it is, which is that he made he made poor Sarah cry. So that is one important point. But in fact, this point about having the duty of facing reality is really interesting politically. So Hannah Arendt, in her book on the origins of totalitarianism, which is a very standard and classic political philosophical text of the 20th century, particularly focusing on the evils of the Holocaust. And she writes, the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth is not that the lie will now be accepted as truth and truth be defamed as a lie, but that the sense by which we take our bearings in the real world is being destroyed. This passage is in fact about Joseph Goebbels and the Nazi propaganda machine. But the point that I think she's making, or the way that I translate this, is Hannah Arendt had this strong insistence that we first have to recognize the facts. Once you recognize the facts, then you can have politics, you can have rational discussion about what the facts mean and what should be done. But this idea of having to take our bearings in the real world, I think, is really important. And I think there's a really interesting ethical question surrounding virtual reality, which is that taken to its limits, it might undermine this requirement to take our bearings in the real world. And I think a really interesting, although very sort of problematic and horrible issue here is Holocaust denial. So in many countries, Holocaust denial is illegal, and the really important point here is you have to recognize the facts. There is a real world, these things happened, they are facts, and the experience that goes with those facts should not be altered, right? So we have to first agree about the facts, then we can have a rational discussion. Now, a second interesting sort of ethical consequence of virtual reality, I can draw from the work of Jürgen Habermas. So Jürgen Habermas is a very influential modern political philosopher who developed this idea of what he calls the public sphere, which I think is a really interesting concept, both ethically and cognitively. And the idea about the public sphere is it's the world, if you like, the public and political space that we inhabit. And I want to suggest that each agent, each healthy adult human agent may have a duty towards others, which is based on the fact that we share a public sphere. Okay, so what this means is that there's a sense in which not all of my experiences can be completely privatized, or my experiences must include this element of the public sphere in order for me to be part of society. And Habermas stressed the idea that the public sphere was essential for rational debate. But I want to suggest that the public sphere begins with experience. It begins with a space of experience. So the thought experiment here for VR/XR is, let's suppose that we produce a technology which gives you an experience that radically alters the public space. So for example, when you walk around in the real world using this technology, you don't see the other people who are there. You don't see that when you sit down in the seat on the bus, there is somebody else sitting next to you, or you don't see that there is somebody else who also wants to have the seat that you have chosen. This is an example where the technology could undermine the idea of a public sphere. In other words, a real world with multiple agents who need to have sufficient shared experiences that they can produce coordinated and hopefully non-conflictual actions. So I think an important part of autonomy of experience, or important limitation of autonomy experience, is that VR type technologies should not restrict our awareness of the other agents in our public sphere, right? So they should not be solipsistic. And in fact, I would sort of blame or ban. Thomas talked about banning. I would restrict purely solipsistic uses of these technologies. Okay, so the final thing I want to say in the last few minutes is I want to talk a little bit about memory. So memory and suggestion. And I just want to begin really with a summary of an interesting controversy in cognitive psychology. Now, I'm not a memory psychologist, so I'm talking well out of area here, but it is an area that I think is of real growing importance for VR, AR, XR. So this is the American psychologist Elizabeth Loftus, and she is a psychologist of memory, and she's been interested in whether we remember what really happened, or whether our memories can be misleading. And she performed a very influential experiment a long time ago now, I think it was in the 70s, where she used techniques which seem a little bit like suggestion to study what people can remember about an event which did not actually happen. So the way that this initial experiment works is she asked an adult to describe their memories of particular events. And these were events that she independently knew had happened. So please tell me about the time that you played for your school on the basketball team. And the participant in the experiment would relate what actually happened when they played for the school on the basketball team. So she basically got people to recount autobiographical memories which she could independently verify. And into the set of questions, she added one memory that had not happened. Tell me about the time you got lost in the shopping mall. Now, the surprising result here is that the participants in the experiment proceeded to describe with some level of detail what had happened on the occasion when they had got lost in the shopping mall. And Elizabeth Loftus and her experimental team independently knew that this had not in fact occurred. So the memory was in that sense a false memory, and it had been implanted, and it had been implanted through suggestion. So the process of the experiment and asking people to describe a memory that they purportedly had about an event which had not in fact occurred had somehow triggered them to, if you like, confabulate experiences which were not true experiences. Now, this is an extremely controversial area. It's caused an enormous amount of argument for several reasons, and there are a number of sort of technical reasons about how the procedure works and whether the procedure is itself ethical. So, is it ethical to do experiments where you sort of trick people to get them to recount memories that that didn't occur? There's a technical question about whether this happens much in real life. Is it just a sort of strange feature about psychological experiments? But the real controversy is not so much the technical controversy as the ethical controversy. So this whole question about false memories has become central to the terrible problem of dealing with child sexual abuse. So the possibility that people might make up memories with the sort of encouragement or connivance or manipulation of people asking them questions, people asking them leading questions, people encouraging them to generate material to describe their experiences. That is really problematic because it may potentially lead to children being encouraged to report instances of abuse which did not in fact occur. So there's an enormous sort of interest, and there's in fact a false memory society which, as it were, likes this kind of research because it suggests that maybe accusations of childhood sexual abuse are fabrications generated by some odd sort of interaction between therapist, child, procedure, and environment. Now, of course, against that, you've got the fact that there is child sexual abuse, and maybe it's quite frequent, and maybe the awful and terrible process of recovery from that, in which the person has to remember and relive and come to terms with those experiences and relate them and describe the facts of what actually occurred in order for legal proceedings to be carried out and for perpetrators to be charged, judged, and condemned. All of that is based on memory, and it's based on memory of experience. So we really need ways to evoke all and only the autobiographical memories of experiences that really happened, excluding fabricated experiences, but not suppressing the true experiences either. So this whole question about memory implantation through suggestion is a total minefield. It's an ethical minefield, and the issue of child sexual abuse could not be more ethically direct and ethically central to our society and to our moral values, and it's all cognitive psychology. So how is this somehow related to the ethics of VR? Well, the point about VR is it is giving people experiences, and it is a technology which has the capacity to make people relive experiences and to resynthesize experiences and to modulate them and change them. So I think a really, really important question for VR is going to be, how will these technologies deal with the autobiographic memory of the user and with the previous experiences of the user when they are being reactivated? So let's just look at this. So first of all, VR is, I think, a potential implanter of false memory. So if we go back to this Loftus idea that you can implant memories of being lost in a mall, I think we can see that a virtual reality game, for example, would be a really quite effective way to try to implant those kind of false memories. It hasn't been done. I hope it doesn't get done, but you can see how it could be used to do so. And of course, it's also a potential moderator of true memories. So representing, reinterpreting, recustomizing experiences with the vividness of VR might be able to implant memories for events that did not occur, and also moderate memories for events which did occur. So, for example, you could either produce a memory or you could remove it. Now, either of those could be extremely ethically significant in terms of human harms, child sexual abuse just being one particularly sort of shocking example. Now, of course, VR will not only be used in that way, and we look, for example, at old photographs and we love it. We look at old photos and we relive experiences, and maybe VR can be used just as a more intense way of doing that, for a re-evocation of autobiographical memory and for the kind of nostalgia machine. What was it like last summer? And that seems great. But I think the critical thing is that I choose to look at last summer's photographs with my family. So it's the voluntary re-evocation of memory is rather distinct from involuntary or semi-voluntary or kind of facilitated manipulation of experience. So I think there's a real ethical risk to the extent that others, industrial providers, colleagues, political forces, third parties, if you like, could be representing and potentially rewriting my autobiography. And I think there's a long history in psychology of what's called iatrogenic effects. So iatrogenic effects basically means that the process of trying to cure somebody in fact might harm them. And I think one of the things that we're going to have to be wary of is virtual reality therapies. They're probably here already. In fact, they are here already for some things like stroke, and they work quite well. But if you think about them for things like recovered memory and trauma and childhood abuse, then you can easily see major risks that therapies might, many therapies have an idea of coming to terms with an experience as at the heart of them. Psychological therapies often encourage you to come to terms with an experience. But if that process involves representing and reinterpreting the experience, then there are a number of problems. First of all, it may be unbearably vivid. It may just be too much. So maybe, in fact, I think it's quite clear in psychological therapy that people do need to come to terms with their experiences, but at their own speed. Is not good normally to flood people with experience. You have to go at your own speed. And I think the vividness of VR is a threat, but also the fact that the experience can be manipulated in the representation, I think will be a concern. So one thing to watch out for, I suspect, is psychological therapists working with children who will use VR to try to find out what happened in that child's past and to get them to come to terms with a traumatic experience. And I think, threats on both sides exist. The threat of memory implantation for something which did not in fact occur, and the threat of revising and attenuating and sort of disappearing the memory for something which did in fact occur. And I think we need to recognize that there are ground truths which, you know, in these cases for people to find happiness and to restore justice, those ground truths need to come out. So just to conclude, I think, of course, VR has highly ethical potential as a force for good. We're all aware of lots of really interesting treatments and interventions and entertainment and other things that we can do with these technologies. But I'd like to highlight two areas of ethical caution. I think it's going to be important not to use VR to rewrite people's autobiographical memory, or it will be necessary to rewrite it very carefully. And I think on the basis of autonomy and voluntary consent. And I think it's going to be important to be careful that the individualization of virtual reality environments, this is the kind of fractionation that we know about from Cambridge Analytica and Facebook and social media bubbles and so on, doesn't undermine the minimal shared experiences that constitute our public sphere. So thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, now it's back. Okay.
Thanks very much. Thank you for a very challenging talk. I wish you could hear all the clapping. So now I'm going to pass over to Jessica Driscoll from Digital Catapult, who's going to chair the panel session. Lots of people are saying things like excellent talk, YouTube and so on. By the way, to both Patrick and Thomas. Brilliant. You may be able to see some of those. So now over to Jessica.
Okay, hi everybody. So welcome to our panel discussion. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to quickly introduce myself, introduce the rest of our panelists, and then we'll jump into some questions from the audience and then maybe some of our own questions as well. So hi everyone, I'm Jessica Driscoll. I look after immersive technology at Digital Catapult. And on our panel today, we have Zilla Watson. Zilla, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Zilla Watson. I've been working in VR since 2015 and done some projects with Mel for the BBC and now at Satori Studio. And possibly because of my original legal training was particularly interested in looking at VR and ethics and how they also related to broadcast regulations.
Thanks very much. And handing over to Dali.
Hi. Thank you for having me. My name is Ali and I'm a user experience researcher working in the domain of VR for the past 3 or 4 years for Google.
Thanks very much. Okay, and I think that Thomas and Patrick have already had their introduction from Mel earlier. So from my standpoint, I've worked in lots of parts of the VR value chain, I suppose. And before starting Digital Catapult, I was working at quite an interesting startup called Cornerstone VR that was using VR in social care settings, 360 videos to help people better understand childhood trauma and neglect. And it was very interesting seeing the impacts and the potential triggers and the protection that the company had to provide in onboarding and offboarding using those experiences. And those are, you know, what some people would consider just 360 films. But I think that some of the topics today, you know, they're very interlinked. So let's kick off with a question from Ewan Lavoie. So this is to Dr. Metzinger. Are you familiar with the Future Humanity Institute out of Oxford? Could this be an avenue to bring together a group of researchers to work on these problems? And then he adds, the problem is that many groups and young people all over the place do important work there, but there's no unified platform. And do you want to create it?
Yeah, that was actually my reply. My perception is that there are really many brilliant young people in many countries who tackle really important issues there. And there are some major players dominating the public debates. And I'm not going to do it, but it would be a major achievement. And how do you say in English? A major merit if somebody could unify this debate. And of course, I know the Future of Humanity Institute. And as I said, they are among the people who make a lot of noise and are highly visible, at least on my end. But it would be good if somebody gave all the many good young people a chance to meet on some platform.
Okay, and he follows up with, in society, we used to have some confidence that those around us were experiencing the same reality as we were. Now, with the advanced smartphone, social media, etc., everyone is basically experiencing their own version of reality that is fed to us by algorithms. So this seems to be a main contributor to political polarization. But more seriously, how will this translate when VR becomes mainstream? So perhaps I could pose that to Patrick.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think this is why I find Habermas so interesting, and the concept of the public sphere so interesting. So in order to have a society in a meaningful sense, you need to have a certain level of not exactly not equality, but sort of shared space where you can have arbitration, and you can have discussions about exactly how resources are used and so on. And this was conceived by Habermas primarily as a political kind of discussion, but unless you actually realize that you're sharing a world with other people, then you won't get that. So I think the fractionation of the media environment is really problematic, because it gives us all our own news and our own truth. But I think the potential fractionation of the quote physical environment or experiential environment, which might follow from VR, is potentially even more worrying. And I think perhaps this is a point where education might be useful, and where one could perhaps indeed use some of these technologies in education to reintegrate as opposed to disintegrate public spaces, and to make people aware of the fact that there are other agents who may see things differently from them, but you need to at least recognize the space in which you meet those other agents. So I think fractionation is going to be a big problem, and I think that's one of the interesting features about the real physical world is, we all see it from a different point of view, but the bench that you sit on and the bench that I sit on are the same bench, and they feel equally cold and equally hard to both of us. And this is somehow so much less true with the technologization of our experience. I think is a big threat.
Zilla, perhaps you could. Oh, sorry, Thomas.
Yes, I just briefly. I was shocked by this Habermas slide, Patrick, because I'm born in Frankfurt. I studied in Frankfurt. I sat in many seminars of Habermas when I studied philosophy.
You're very lucky.
Years ago, and my mother and Habermas' wives were very good friends as students. So I've been steeped in this stuff. And an important technical concept there is the Lebenswelt, the life world. And the idea in the old times was that even scientists and philosophers with very different opinions have a non-transcendable background. And that's the life world from which they come. And this is a way of making this point that was just brought up very clearly. This technology fragments life worlds. Yeah. I really very acutely feel that my life world is very different from that of my 22-year-old nephew, for instance. And the number of available life worlds has, been greatly fragmented and split up. And that is actually an important thing for democracy. We only have 22 stable democracies on the planet. And it looks as if for the rational discourse, you also mentioned, democracies need a shared life world. And that's an interesting topic for discussion. How can we design VR environments in a way that they don't destroy that?
And there is, I wonder if I could just come back. I mean, there are some old and very good precursors here. So for example, in the domain of teleeducation, there's been a long tradition of, for example, children in remote areas using video conferencing to come into larger classrooms. And I mean, you can see the enormous building potential that that this would have for building a public sphere and a shared experience for those children. So rather than being educated in isolation, each in their own sort of bush outstation. I think Australia was the world leader in this. The kids can come together in a virtual classroom. Absolutely fantastic. But I think that was a government design program, and the general direction of the trajectory is in the opposite way. Fragmentation.
Okay, and Zilla, would you like to comment about the kind of VR going mainstream? Because I guess the BBC has done more than a lot of people to try to make that so, especially with the large program that you did in the public libraries of showing VR too.
Yeah, from the start, I suppose I did see VR as a continuation of what we were trying to do as a broadcaster 100 years ago, taking theatres into people's living rooms via radio. And I do think it's true that, I mean, I've read many concerned essays from the early 1950s about television and the damage it was doing children. And the issues aren't very different from many of the things we've been discussing today, although they're far more nuanced now. With VR. I did a report for the Reuters Journalism Institute a few years ago where I surveyed a lot of the news organizations who went into VR very early, to some extent with tech seed funding money as well to encourage them to go into it, like the New York Times. And all the news organizations that had some kind of ethics code were probably quite cautious about what VR content they created, but because of that, because it is known in broadcast that certain images might harm people, and we generally avoid that unless it's editorially justified. And in the UK, there is a strong code, especially for broadcast, to protect people. But at the same time, they all felt those codes could be applied to VR. The thing that none of us could get our heads around, and again, the scale that was missing, was something around additional intensity, that you can look away from a television, but when you've got a virtual reality headset on, it's there and you're stuck there. And we've noticed that with the BBC's big audience study in public libraries last summer. Even with 360 videos, people thought they were in the Congo seeing gorillas. They really did. So we know it's powerful, and we had no real measure of that intensity. So we erred on the side of absolute caution in terms of what we showed and what we allowed people to be exposed to. But if that is not the case, I certainly believe it could be very harmful and upsetting. And I've been through extremely disturbing and upsetting VR experiences where I've not been warned what was going to happen at festivals, and it can be very shocking.
Yes, I'm very much a fan of warning and onboarding people for sure. Yes, Sylvia, did you have something to add?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a couple of things that I wanted to say, and exactly like Zila said, I think in VR there's no escape, but actually at the same time it's also very different from the mobile phone, because they actually take some effort to put a headset on to sort of adjust it. So I think, as you said, onboarding people, when people are kind of more intentionally choose to get into VR, right? So I think maybe it's going to be slightly less addictive because of this. My mobile phone sometimes, I'm just gonna spend a minute on it and ended up spending an hour, right? And in VR, that might be less of a problem. So that's kind of a bit of a positive news on that. And another sort of positive news I want to also express here is that because I am here really because I teach VR to lots of students. I have an online course with probably 50,000 learners now. But on my on-campus course at Goldsmith, we really see that now we have lots of students with a humanity background now getting into VR. Like they might have a filmmaking background or architecture or design, and I think that's really bringing something new to VR. It's really different from maybe previously game developer or graphics researchers that just want to do something cool. There's nothing wrong about it. But now we have people from humanity, and they actually have some positive message they want to send. They're more careful in what message and mechanism through which they're sending it, rather than just the technology per se. So I just wanted to add this.
No, I totally agree, Sylvia. That convergence is very, very interesting, that socio-technical blend. Dali, do you have anything to add to that question?
Yeah, just a quick comment that the level of friction, I think it's obviously the intention of the person, but then sort of the immersiveness, which you don't have with other mediums such as photographs or even videos. It's something to consider. I quickly wanted to add, we are doing a lot of research in training, and sometimes a realistic environment could trigger different states from the person that's doing the training. And if you think of someone like a police or someone doing word trade or any other kind of high intensity or high stress training, without understanding the mental state or health of the person doing the training, you could elicit a lot of negative reactions. I think on one side of the spectrum is the training is just not going to work on that person, which is not terrible, but it's just inefficient. But on the other end, you could even create some health concerns that you were not expecting. So there is that concern as well.
Okay, thank you. So we've got another question from the audience here from David Murphy. So one way to avoid monopolies of VR platforms and environments, should we encourage support and adoption of standards, such as those being developed by the W3C and IEEE? Maybe I could put that to Thomas?
Well, I don't know the technical background there, but it is a problem of a world public and distributive justice. There should be available and accessibility for everyone. And of course, we have major players working against this, but most of you are the tech experts. Tell me, what do you think is the best solution in terms of standards?
Okay, I'll throw that over to Sylvia because I think she she was going to answer it live.
Yeah, that's a really difficult one. Yeah, no, I mean, we all know what happened yesterday. That was a Facebook Connect, and yeah. So well, basically, you know, the standalone device that we have now, Oculus Quest 2, is going to be the cheapest device, and lots of people will have that. But now Facebook is basically forcing people to connect their Oculus account, their Facebook account. And I tried to apply for a alternative Facebook account yesterday, and they somehow linked that to my main account. And so basically there's like one user per account on Facebook or something. They're really trying to link it to your real identity. But anyway, so from a technical perspective, basically, you know, whoever owns technology will thrive here, and they will dominate. They will basically define the actual device you have, and you know how to basically monetize with the device. And with Facebook, it's monetization through data, and with which privacy is a big concern. But they do have the technology. It's much better. So they use inside-out tracking. There's no setup, right? And you don't need a Windows machine to actually support the device. So you know it's much cheaper. Everybody can just pay $300 and have one. And then they really have the gesture tracking working as well. So until somebody else, you know, come up with a compatible technical solution, I think, unfortunately, we're going to be dominated by Quest 2 for the next, I don't know, year or month, hopefully.
Thank you. Zilla, did you have something to add?
I think this is a massive problem that essentially the technology and the platform for accessing that is controlled by a West Coast company. That is certainly one of the reasons why a broadcaster like the BBC has paused on VR right now, because of the distribution issues. You can't ensure that content is safely distributed to your audience if you don't run the platform. So I do think that is a huge potential risk, that we have no control over what content is put there and how it is received by audiences, and it needs to be addressed.
Could I ask about software standards? So you've been talking primarily about hardware, and of course hardware is the gateway, but is there a tradition in the VR industry of developing software guidelines about a little bit like films come with, you know, X-rated, 12-rated, and you know, okay for kids?
At the moment, this is content warnings. At the moment, there's a real issue that they're using the PEGI standards that work for games. Yeah. So that can lead to some extraordinary anomalies. As I've said before, there's no understanding of the different intensity, but something that would be editorially justified in the BBC, like a VR piece that used archive to take you on a bombing raid of Berlin, but it was, you know, an authentic. It was, you know, it was done well, and it was showing you what happened. Got an extraordinarily high rating because it, you know, technically the questions involve ticking boxes on, is this about warfare, as a game would. So they're not nuanced for the sort of content that people are making. So that does need to be addressed. I
think also the content that private companies make for training, you know, they're under no obligation to put any kind of warning on them at all. It's down to the discretion of the company. I think, Thomas, you raised your hand just before Zilla started speaking. Did you have something to add to that?
Just very quickly, I think many people still underestimate the accumulation of political power, for instance, behind Facebook. So for millions of people, say in countries like the Philippines or Myanmar, Facebook and internet is the same thing. They are working to make Africa like this right now, that many users will not really understand the difference between Facebook and internet. And the big danger is, of course, that the same happens for VR, that there are millions of human beings who do not really grasp the difference between being in VR and being a Facebook customer or a Facebook user. I wonder if any of you have anything to say about this.
I think that's very interesting. I think that harks back to Sylvia's point about multiple distribution channels being available and access to multiple hardware, because like you said, if people do associate VR with Facebook and that's the only way to ever consume that content, it could be a big problem. We've got another question from the audience here, from Valentine Val. It is, AR also brings an unlearning effect when showing us information on an object we used to learn before. How do you define an ethical frontier between help of AR and this unlearning effect? If I could put that to Dali, if you're still with us. I'm not sure if Dali's there.
I think she has a bit of technical
audio problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Would anyone else like to pick up that question on the unlearning effect of having AR transposed on the real world?
I'm not entirely sure I understand that. Can someone maybe explain it a little? What is the
So I think what Valentine is trying to get across is that, say, for example, wayfinding in AR, you know, maybe before we would have tried to figure out the way to it, or maybe before we would have figured out how to use a piece of technology like a washing machine. So if we had AR as a kind of learning aid to all of that, and we could just pull out our phone, put the AR overlay over the top and learn something, are we then doing ourselves a disservice and unlearning things? I think that's what the question is.
Well, I think it will be, you know, depending on individuals, right? Like, you know, how much we use computers and how I took actually all the notes on a piece of paper. So I'm not unlearning writing, I'm still writing. So I think, yeah.
Go ahead, Thomas.
That was disappointing that you actually write on paper.
I think it's good. I think it's good.
I just want, this embodiment stuff. So I just want to give one criterion. Does a technology or the effect it has increase the user's mental autonomy? This also connects to Patrick's talk, or does it decrease it? And if it makes me unlearn relevant capacities to interact with my everyday environment that I had before, it decreases my autonomy. So autonomy enhancement could be one normative criteria we judge this by.
Okay.
This anxiety has happened time and time again in the history of technology. That doesn't mean that we should ignore it, but when print became widespread, there was a great fear that people would no longer be able to listen because they would get all their information from reading. So I think, you know, human mind has a high adaptability. I think there are some concerns. I think the possible threats to writing at the moment are very high. So I think we're within a few years of children not being taught to write, and I think that's potentially a concern. And I think there's a lot of concern at the moment, particularly around navigation, that nobody knows where anything is anymore. People know how to get there using Google Maps, but they don't know where something is. So the idea that you form a cognitive map of your environment or your country or your world, that has basically gone. Now, I don't know whether we can survive without it, but there's a long history of the way that all of these technologies interact with our cognition, and they allow us to offload bits of our own mind onto the device. I mean, that's what writing is. Writing is a kind of cognitive offloading, and so too is automatic navigation.
Thank you. Okay, we've got another question from the audience. How concerned are the speakers about how long-term use of XR can fragment somatic experience? Is there any connection with chronic disorders of the vestibular system, balance and spatial orientation? Mel or Thomas? Mel, go ahead.
So this is something positive for a change. A few years ago at UCL, we ran a study with, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the main psychologist involved, where they were taking people who had disturbances, and we used a virtual reality application in order to help them correct those vestibular disturbances. So the answer is yes, there is a connection between virtual reality and somatic experience. But of course, what I'm saying is that this obviously through simulator sickness, this is an example of aspect of that. Exactly the same ideas can be used for positive application.
Did you want to add something to Thomas? Go ahead.
Very quickly. I think Michael Madari and me were the first, I've also briefly said it in the talk, to mention this possibility of depersonalization disorder and all these embodiment disorders. I just want to highlight that this was speculative, and that at least to the best of my knowledge, there are no robust or replicated data on this, that this might actually happen. It's highly intuitive what the question asked about, that might happen. It's really intuitive, but there are just not so many long-term users so far. So it's not true if it's not clear if it's a real risk. That's all I wanted to say.
Okay, and we've got I guess a related question from David Murphy again. My research is in the development and integration of biosensors, EEG, GSR, etc., into VR and XR systems. I've thought a lot about ethical issues and concerns, but I would welcome thoughts on research in this direction. If anyone has any recommendations for David.
I guess I have a comment. So it relates to the crazy scenario that Thomas brought up about the real-time feedback with the neural correlates of consciousness. So I think anything with a feedback loop is always more problematic than something without a feedback loop. So I think there is a potential concern with technologies which read brain signals and adapt stimulation according to the brain signal. So I think VR it's an input to the brain, but it uses the brain's natural sensory receptors. It's not a direct input like an electrical stimulation or a brain stimulation. But I think in general, whenever you close a feedback loop, you have a lot more risks than when you don't. So I think my general feeling would be that driving signals, driving VR inputs from brain readouts would be something I would do rather carefully, because you may be reading the wrong signals from the brain, you may be misinterpreting this.
Go ahead, Sylvia.
Can I also add something? Yeah, because I work with those sensors, and I think actually I'd be more worried about because I mean EEG and GSR, you know, they're good signals to integrate with VR, but I'm less worried about brain signal, because we all know, oh sorry, EEG is brain signal, sorry. GSR is quite easy to integrate, but EEG is actually really noisy. It's really difficult to be sure, unless you do invasive, you put invasive probes in your brain. We also try to link up, I think, as nerves with VR, and it was just such a big mess as well. So I don't really see there is a way that is uninvasive that we can get stable brain signals. I'm less worried about that. But what I am really worried about is actually a lot of the sort of data already we're putting into existing VR these days. You know, like when I'm waving this, it's getting 6 degrees of freedom of my hand and my head and where I'm looking at. And also Vive Pro Eye now have eye tracking. I think Vive is also working on lip tracking and sort of around your eye, getting lots of really expressions or micro expressions from our face. And this is actually, we can interpret a psychological state from a person together with the VR displays, because we have access to the virtual world, to the digital world as well. And combining this, we're actually, getting a lot of information from this person who is inside VR, right? I'm a lot more concerned of this area, which is yet to be explored, but there is a lot of, but I also want to add, as a researcher, I think this is great because that really helps us to understand, have new ways to help people with neurological disorders such as autism or dementia. But at the same time, if this data goes into the hand of, the other side, and it could be quite disastrous. Basically.
Exactly. Who owns that data and where does it go, and what agency does the person who's doing the experience have?
And how much you then link it with your other data populated on social media.
Exactly. And I think you said a key word there, interpreted. How is that data interpreted? Yeah. Mel, I know that you had a couple of questions for the panel. Would you like to pose those?
Yes, I'd like to, first of all, say something on the positive side. So this is just an example. So there was a concert I missed a long time ago, and I thought, when I saw this concert partly on YouTube, I thought I'd really like to go to that concert. Of course, I can't because I can't time travel yet. But so what we did is we reconstructed parts of that concert in virtual reality, where it's a long process and we've just started. And I went into the concert recently, and I had a really, really interesting experience. Of course, it's nothing like a really exciting experience, even like tears coming to the eyes and so on, experiencing something that I could never have experienced. And for people who were at that concert, they can also go back in virtual reality and have some idea again of how exciting being at that concert was. So I'd like to come back to a point that Patrick made. I also would argue that virtual reality experience is a real experience. If I go in virtual reality and I'm confronted with a precipice, I'm confronted with this, my heart starts racing and so on. But at the same time, I also, I remember putting on this head-mounted display. I know it's not there. I call this the reality gap, that although the experiences are real, you always have this demarcation around them because you've done something Sylvia said, you've done a whole set of activities that make it possible for you to have that experience. So what my question is, that one could go to this seminar and get quite depressed about virtuality. On the positive, should we just give up because there are too many ethical dangers? Or what on the positive side, how would you say we proceed? Like with Thomas, who is it that should make, for example? Yes, there should be rules, but who should be making them? Maybe there's lessons we learn from movies and television and so on, and adverts even for that kind of thing. And with respect to what Patrick said about memory, I agree, it certainly could be used to implant false and dangerous memories. I would give the example there of a positive side of that, which is PTSD. There's a huge amount of work on PTSD, especially in the United States, where soldiers come back from a war and they've suffered these trauma. And it's been shown now over at least 15 years already, that the use of virtual reality to re-experience aspects of the trauma as part of a therapy, always this is important. It's not just you experience the trauma, but you experience it as part of a program of therapy that even though it's implanting a false memory because it never happened like that, it nevertheless gets people out of the trap of PTSD. So I'd like to hear some positive comments at the end. What's the way?
I think that there's an immeasurable amount of joy that can be derived from virtual reality experiences, from entertainment. The other day I was watching some of the Venice Film Festival selection with my mother and father, and it was a piece about Indonesia and just kind of memories, animation through the years, and it was hugely beneficial for them because they've been in lockdown, they haven't been able to visit Indonesia, and being there, even in the animated sense, it wasn't a 6-DoF experience, it was a 3-DoF experience, just seated. Watching their faces was absolutely wonderful. And I think that people shouldn't forget that, and also the capabilities for education. There are so many positives. And I think in many ways, a lot of these ethical considerations are exactly what Thomas and Patrick said, are in the future a little bit. You know, we're horizon scanning. I think what's out now and what's happening now is still, you know, there's still a way for us to go before we get into some of those quandaries. Patrick or Thomas, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, I could comment a little bit about PTSD. So I'm aware of that work, and I think it's really great. And my understanding of PTSD is that you do have to deal with the traumatic experience somehow. And the critical thing is that the patient has to have autonomous control of how they reactivate, reawaken, and relive that experience, which might include saying, no, I'm not going there, I need to move on. So a very common sort of, if you look at, quite interesting perspective on trauma is to look at traumas that everybody shares. So these are things like earthquakes and disasters. And some people are actually better just walking away and trying not to go back. And other people need to go back. And one of the really tricky judgments that the good therapist has to make is, how do you take the person back at the right speed and to the right, you know, how far back do you take them? Because there comes a point when ideally the person will say, okay, well, I don't need to do that now. I've dealt with it. And for some people, you know, flooding them with reactivation of the experience can be quite destructive. For other people, they do need to spend a lot of time going back. So I think, you know, good therapists will use virtual reality in good ways, but bad therapists might use it problematically. I think so. Lots of good stories, but human judgment and respect of autonomy is always going to be there.
Can I add something which is slightly related to Patrick's note and also what Mel said earlier about shall we all give up? I think, you know, if for anyone here on the panel and or the attendee or the ones on YouTube or whoever watched it, spent good 2 hours almost watching things on ethics, we're the ones who really care about ethics, right? VR is not going to stop because we stop. So we need to make sure if we actually care about ethics, we should, you know, make sure we do more in VR than less, because there are other people who doesn't care about ethics will continue doing in VR anyway. So that's just something I want to make sure I emphasize.
Yes, that's a very good point. Thomas, did you have a point to make?
Yeah, actually 3. So first note to Patrick, I thought this idea of iatrogenic false memories was very important and a brilliant point. You might want to look into the literature of what was called dissociative identity disorder, because there you have exactly that case that it was a fad in some countries and you had a lot of diagnosis and it didn't appear in other countries as well. This might be a perfect model. So on the negative and on the positive side, I am just completely sobered by my 24 months Brussels experience. I just have to admit this. I thought I was a politically critical person, but I would have never dreamt that this whole process is so contaminated by consultancies and political lobbyism until I collided with them. I would have never thought that. I don't want to discourage anybody, but it's messy up there and the large companies have a lot of money to invest. To give an example of what I think is really positive is something like gradual time travel. Imagine we have these big art exhibitions, say in London or in New York, where pieces of art come together for 6 months only, and then they never come together in that combination again. If you were to properly begin recording high-level exhibitions at selected places in the world, this will enable, you know, people in the outback in Australia or poor people in the third world to walk through these exhibitions in 20 years. So you could have VR archives of art events, culture events that were unique. You know, it also speaks to Mel's initiative. So I would put a lot of money in just very good recording of excellent exhibitions. and creating an archive for humanity that is open access, where you don't have to pay. And everybody can walk through that exhibition even in 50 years. That would be a great achievement, I think.
We've got another question from the audience. So we've got both talks from Pierre, both talks pointed to the importance of reality versus virtuality or artificial reality. If we can't trust the experiences that we are living to be real, then how do we know what is real? And therefore how to trust our memories? Do you think there will still be a spinning top like the one in Inception film that we could be relying on, haptics or proprioception? It's quite a tricky question, isn't it? Zilla, do you have any thoughts on that? What can we?
Well, again, but I just go back to a broadcast debate about reconstructions, where in the end, because people did get confused on television between actual filmed scenes and historical reconstructions, for example, on crime programs, you have to label them as reconstructions. If you're, with VR, it's difficult because the whole thing is often, if it's created in a game engine, the whole thing is technically a reconstruction. So to some extent, the sort of film analogy doesn't quite work once you're creating content in a different way. But yeah, we will have to get better audience research to understand if people are confused and find ways to address that if they are. We don't have enough research to back that up yet.
Mel, do you have anything to add to that with your research?
No, I agree completely. Yeah, I would just add that sometimes the most innocuous, innocent virtual reality that you develop can have very unusual effects on the people who use it, things that you never thought of at all. So the absolute care and caution, as Patrick was saying as well, is very important in these things.
Maybe just add a small comment, because I'm the developer here. I think, used to at least. I just feel like when I was developing VR, there's so many little decisions I am making as a developer. I can't even, put a list on it. Basically, everything I do, every line of code I write, every texture I imported, every parameter I set on my textures, these are all decisions I made as a developer. And, we have to have some kind of regulation to control this, but it's going to be a long journey.
And Patrick, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I'd just like to pick up on some of the keywords in the question. And I think it's a philosophical position, but I believe there is a physical world out there, and I believe that I am one object in that physical world. And I think all of my experience and my cognition starts with my body. And as long as we have bodies, and as long as we don't have technologization of the basic biological process of making new bodies through reproduction and being bodies as we all are, I think that is going to be a major way of distinguishing reality from virtuality. So there's a nice example in the 18th century where Bishop Berkeley said that there's no external world and everything is all in my mind. And Dr. Johnson's counter argument was to kick a stone and to say, I refute him thus. So the interaction of Dr. Johnson's foot with the physical world, kicking the stone, in which he knew about because of the tactile and proprioceptive sensation in his foot when he kicked the stone, is this kind of reassurance of the external reality in which our bodies also participate.
Yes, well, there are some very heavy thoughts there to kind of chew over. And I think one of the important things, as I'm sure everyone on the panel will agree, is to continue the dialogue, not at the risk of presenting the bottleneck, though. I think we've lost Thomas. Maybe he'll come back in a minute. That might be a good time, unless there's no other questions, to start rounding up. What do you think, Mel and Sylvia? Oh, Gazilla, go ahead.
Can I just add a final positive note, just following on from Mel's comment earlier, which is just about the positive benefits of VR. At the BBC, we were trying to see whether, like broadcasting, VR could inform, educate and entertain. And there's absolutely no question from the research we did that it can. With Mel, we took people back to the Russian Revolution to become Lenin and showed that they became more interested in Russian history. We also took people to the migrant crisis and again demonstrated more interest and engagement with the migrant crisis in the news. And then with more anecdotal studies in public libraries, we found that people became more interested in Africa after watching a series on the Congo, and we couldn't have dreamed for such a strong response to content. We also found that people, as a result of VR, loved the BBC, which they don't always do. The audience research had never, ever been so positive about the organisation. So I'm very convinced of the deep and profound benefits it can have in terms of that sort of engagement around understanding the world.
I completely agree with you, Zilla, and I think the ability to reach different audiences. When we worked on the BBC Civilizations app together, the AR app, that was picked up by Apple as one of the apps of the year. It had over 1 million downloads, so something that potentially a arts and cultural app wouldn't have had that reach. But you know, it was hugely engaging and also gave a platform to all of those smaller museums throughout the country as well. That was really great. Plus my very silly 360 wrestling documentary called Progress, which wasn't very worthy but incredibly entertaining. So if you haven't seen that, guys, I'll send you a build so you can have a look. Thomas, Patrick, did you have something to round off with on a positive note?
Well, no, I think I agree about the enormous positive benefits of VR and the great things that we can do with it. I think I'd say something positive about the process that we're actually going through now. So many decades ago, I sat on a government committee which was concerned with the possible health effects of mobile phones. So that was, you know, way back in the 1990s when we still worried about whether mobile phones would fry our brain. And I think I learned from that you know, precautionary principle is fine, openness to new technology is fine, but there really is an advantage in getting a group of interested and aware people together to debate the issues around technology risks. And the history of technology is littered with, you know, unanticipated consequences. And I don't think we will anticipate all of the consequences, but I see absolutely no harm and potentially a lot of benefit in thinking about the issues. So a positive thing, I think, would be the creation of a specific debate around VR, which often people might sort of think doesn't raise any ethical issues different from broadcasting or different from AI, whereas I think we would say it does. And the capacity to discuss horizon scanning and what the possible things that we need to be aware of would be. And I entirely agree with Thomas that we need to be aware of the other stakeholders in this game, but we need to be thinking. So that's a positive ending.
Thank you. Any closing remarks from Sylvia or Mel?
Yes, just very quickly, you know, nobody can really follow Patrick, but I'm just going to add a very specific point that, as I mentioned earlier, I think VR is actually in a way democratizing technology. So because lots of people from design and media background actually see VR being the next big thing, but then in order to do good VR, in order to really be in control with the application, you actually have to learn programming. And I think that's a really positive thing that I see, that we are having a lot of students who we don't normally expect, you know, female students, minorities. And I think, you know, overall, that's definitely a very positive thing.
Mel, do you have anything to round off with?
Yes, I think the point that Sylvia made before was a very important one to remember, that we're developers and creators of environments in virtual reality. And obviously, we're here because we care about ethics. So if we stop, as she said, it carries on anyway. I think that's a particularly important point. I'd like to just take the opportunity of thanking everyone involved in today's today's seminar. Thanks to Patrick and Thomas and Zilla and Jessica and Sylvia especially for the whole series. It wouldn't have been possible since last May to be able to do all these, because she took technical command of everything and has been very, very helpful in all this. So
I've learned a lot.
Just
thank you.
want to say thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having us all, and also thank you very much to the audience, and also hope the future viewers enjoy the piece as well. So thanks very much, and lovely to meet you, Patrick. Hope to meet you face to face one day, and try the Lenin thing again, because I only tried it, Zilla, when it was in its first prototypes. So I'd like to try the whole thing.
Okay, I'm just going to stop live